We're at the Young Israel of North Beverly Hills Jewish History Lecture Series. And of course, let me begin by thanking Ernie and Regina Goldberger so much for the use of their help. Thank you very much. Come out. Let me begin by saying Chag Sameach, because tonight is Tu B'Shvat, and believe it or not, as only rabbis can, I will connect Tu B'Shvat to tonight's lecture. The Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says that there's 4 occasions when we celebrate Rosh Hashanah. We're only really familiar with one, which is the 1st of Tishrei. 1st of Tishrei is when the world gets judged, and we're very familiar with that Rosh Hashanah period. There's another 3 Rosh Hashanahs. There's a Rosh Hashanah for bringing gifts to the temple and coming to the king, which is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, on the 1st of Nisan. There's another Rosh Hashanah which is on the 1st of Elul. It's a counting year, end of the fiscal year. And the final Rosh Hashanah is the one which we're familiar with as Tu B'Shvat. We don't call it Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah Le'ilonos, Rosh Hashanah of the trees. My question is, why in heaven's name, if we no longer celebrate 2 out of the 3, do we celebrate the 3rd, besides of course for the Rosh Hashanah that we celebrate? There's 3 that are no longer really relevant to us. Ilanot is not relevant, fiscal year isn't relevant, and nor is bringing gifts to the temple relevant. Why of those 3 do we still commemorate and celebrate Tu B'Shvat?
Food.
Thank you, Simon.
That's true, it's very elevated.
Why?
For the benefit of our YouTube viewers, Simon said food.
So trees take up CO2 and lower this.
The answer, of course, is the connection to the land of Israel. That is our connection. In fact, men or human beings are compared to the trees in the field. That's what it says in the verse. Why the trees in the field? Because trees in the field have roots that go deep into the land. And our roots go deep into the land of Israel. We're not celebrating tonight because of the fruit that we eat, Simon. We celebrate because we're celebrating the fact that we still are closely connected to the land of Israel. What a fitting beginning to a lecture where we're going to be talking about the Jewish people returning from Babylon to the land of Israel. Did I get that connection? Did I get it?
Well done.
We are connected to the land of Israel. Last week we heard about Cyrus, Koresh. It's a name that's still used in Persia. He was the king of Persia. Cyrus the Great issued a proclamation in which he said that the Jewish people, possibly all people, should return to their lands. In the Jewish people's case, to return to their land, the land of Israel. And I want to describe to you, if I may, I want to give you a feeling of what was going on. Because, you know what, we get onto an El Al plane, wherever we may be on the globe, and we arrive in the land of Israel. And we feel we're coming to the land of milk and honey. It's a beautiful country, built up. The fields are lush and green. We drive along freeways and highways and byways and look at the beauty of the country. We look forward to that trip. We look forward to being there. And we regret when we have to leave. But you know what? In the 6th century, before the Christian era, that was not the land of Israel. Let's think where the Jews were coming from. Babylon. Babylon was the center of human civilization. One of the most beautiful countries in the world. The descriptions that we see in historical documents of Babylon, the colors of the buildings, the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world, cultivated horticulture. A most beautiful country, a country where it must have been a pleasure to live and must have been enjoyable to be a part of. And 40-something thousand Jews, according to the text of our Hebrew scriptures, left Babylon, left this beautiful civilized place, and went where? To a barren hilltop in the middle of the Judean hills. A place that was rocky and uncultivated. A place that was full of ruins, full of broken rocks and broken bricks. And why? Because they loved the land of Israel. Nothing can tear the Jewish people from their country. Nothing can tear the Jewish heart from the pulse of the land of Israel. And they returned there despite the fact that it was barren and desolate, and despite the fact that it was entirely inhospitable, and despite the fact that only a few decades before it had been devastated by the marauding armies of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. They came back. And that's really, I'm giving you a little bit of background, tapestry, to explain to you exactly what was going on in the period that we're about to describe. The country that they returned to wasn't really a country, it was a province. So interesting that in recent history we've had exactly the same thing again. When the Jews returned in the 19th century, in the various waves of Aliyah to the land of Israel, it was a province. It was a forgotten province of the Turkish Empire. And that's exactly what the land of Israel was in the time of the Babylonian and then the Persian Empire. It was a place called Yehud, or Yehud Medinata. Yehud Medinata means the province of the Jews. Yehud became the common term that was used for the first time. We see, for example, in Megillat Esther, what is Mordechai called? Mordechai HaYehudi, but we know he came from the tribe of Benjamin. Yehudi became a descriptive term for Jews. Some say it was a pejorative term. But this was the country of the Jews. And that's the word, that's the name that stuck right through the ages. It was Yehud, Judea. The Greeks called it that, the Romans called it that. And until much, much later on, until after the second revolt that's going to end our course in a few weeks' time, until Bar Kokhba, the name of the land of Israel was not Eretz Yisrael, it was Yehuda, Yehud Medinata. Yehud was an autonomous province of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, which stretched, if you remember the maps from last week, I did not bring it this week, we're going to look at them again, which stretched far and wide, 127 provinces. This was one of those provinces, one of those 127 provinces, and it was roughly equivalent, not quite the same, roughly equivalent to the former kingdom of Judah. Now if you recall, at the end of the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, there was two kingdoms in the land of Israel. There was the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel was devastated by the Assyrian hordes, and there was a rump of Jews that was left behind in the kingdom of Judah, and then later on the kingdom of Judah was devastated by the Babylonians. But the kingdom of Judah was the same area, the same space in the land of Israel as the Yehud Medinata was at the end of the Babylonian exile. What was that? So in the north, you had a place called Mitzpah. Mitzpah was in fact the capital, not Jerusalem. We're going to get to that in a minute. We always consider the fact that Jerusalem was the eternal capital of the Jews. No, Jerusalem was no longer the capital of the Jews. At that time there was a place called Mitzpah. Archaeological evidence, which usually is what we have to rely on for so many ancient facts, things that we don't know from recorded history, is very sparse. In fact, they've not really found any strong evidence for the early period of the second temple. You know that they're always searching for the evidence of Solomon's temple, but they can't find it because there were so many rebuildings and knocking downs and rebuildings of that space, that small piece of real estate in Jerusalem, that they haven't really found anything that can establish for certain that which happened at the beginning of the Second Temple period that we're discussing. However, we have a fantastic record in the last books of Tanakh. The last books of Tanakh, which describe this period, are mainly prophetic works, but they also have a narrative, kind of a story, biography, one of Ezra and one of Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah didn't in fact live right at the beginning of this period. You're going to hear that they came a little bit later, but they describe the beginning of this period. And I want to deal first of all with the characters. We're going to go through the cast list, and then we're going to describe what happened. So the cast list is as follows. There's a man called Sheshbazzar. Sheshbazzar was a descendant of King David, probably a grandson of the second last king of Judah, who was called Yehoiachim, and he was known as a prince of Judah. He's named by Ezra, so the book of Ezra talks about those first few years of the resettlement, and he's named by Ezra as the leader of the group of returning Jews. He was the one who got permission from Cyrus. He's the one who returned with the Jews, with the 42,000 and something Jews, and came back to the land of Israel. He was followed, it's a bit obscure, he was followed by Zerubabel. When I say obscure, is that suddenly the text stopped talking about Sheshbazzar and starts talking about Zerubabel. And there's great speculation among the scholars whether Sheshbazzar was Zerubabel, or whether these were two different people, were they related, were they not related. It's very hard to tell. Zerubabel was a leader of the Jews, possibly the same leader as Sheshbazzar. He's also named by Ezra as Sheshbazzar's successor. But perhaps he was a successor because he changed his name, or because Zerubabel somehow described where he came from. He was born in Bavel, but he now landed up Bavel. In Bavel, so he was born in Bavel, but he ended up in Yehud Medinata, and he now becomes the leader of the Jews. He's the one who rebuilt the temple, or began the rebuilding of the temple. His partner in this grand scheme was a man called Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok Kohen Gadol. A very important piece of information is the fact that the most prominent priestly family was the Tzadok family. If you had the last name Tzadok and you were a Kohen, you were in for life. Because the Tzadok family had for many hundreds of years dominated the priests and the high priest. You couldn't become a high priest unless you had the last name Tzadok, unless you were descended from the original Tzadok, HaKohen Tzadok Kohen Gadol. It took the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, to break that dominance. When the Maccabees took power, and they beat, as we're going to hear in the coming weeks, they beat back the Hellenized Jews and the Greeks who were trying to take over the land of Israel, they began to dominate the priestly class, and the Tzaddokites were shunted aside, were marginalized. But now, here at the beginning of this period, and we're talking about the 6th century, it was the Tzadok clan that were the prominent clan. If you want to see a genealogy of the Tzadok family, you can see it in Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 to 4. Genealogy plays a very big role in biblical texts. So you often see lists of names. We're familiar with it from our readings on Shabbos, reading the Parshiot. We can see that knowing who your father and grandfather and great-grandfather was is a very important thing. At the end of Bereshit, at the end of Noach, and many other places in the Chumash, we have listings and countings of names. That persists right the way through the Tanakh, and in fact it makes its way not just through the Tanakh, but all the way through the Apocrypha and into the Christian scriptures as well. In fact, the first thing that we see in the Christian scriptures is a genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth and how he is descended from Judah, which makes him king of the Jews. A very puzzling genealogy which we'll get to when we describe the Christian scriptures. Then we have prophets. Haggai. Who is Haggai? Haggai, actually, we know very little about. He was the 10th of the 12 minor prophets. If you remember, there's a book called Treasar. I don't expect it's for any of you bedtime reading, but there it is in Tanakh. And there's 12 prophets. The 10th of those 12 is somebody called Haggai. He doesn't have much to say. The prophecies of Haggai are exactly 2 chapters long. We don't know much about him, but we do know that he exhorted the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem to finish building the temple, and because of that we can actually date when he lived, although even that's a matter for dispute, as you're going to hear a little bit later tonight. Zechariah. Everyone's heard of Zechariah. Zechariah was the 11th of the 12 minor prophets, and he lived during the same period as Haggai, and he was obviously a more dominant prophet. He was somebody who wrote a lot and was listened to, and whose words resonate to this day. Then we have Ezra. Ezra is Ezra the scribe, Ezra HaSofer. Ezra is possibly, after Moshe Rabbeinu, in terms of religious leadership, the most important figure in Jewish history. Aren't we all just a bit embarrassed that we know so little about him? He is so important. You're going to learn today how important Ezra was. He arrived in Yehud about 100 years after the first returnees, and he was possibly the high priest. He's certainly a Kohen, but what's interesting about that is, for the first time, that wasn't what was important in terms of how he was defined. We're going to learn about that as well. He was defined not as a Kohen, but as a sofer. And we see here a fantastic shift in the leadership structure of the Jews. A very important shift. We're going to define that a little bit later on. In rabbinic literature, he's credited with re-establishing Judaism. Nothing less, nothing more. He re-established the Jewish faith. If you look at the Gemara in Sukkah, the Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Chof Amud Aleph 20a, describes how Ezra HaSofer re-established the Judaism that we know today. He created a body called the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. We've heard of it. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah was later the Sanhedrin, which is a Greek word, but the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah did something extremely important. They established our tefillot. They established what it is we have to daven, because davening didn't really exist in the first temple period in the same way as it developed during the second temple period. And the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah was based on, and we're this week in Parshas Yisro, the advice of Yisro that he gave to his son-in-law Moshe: create Shivim Zakenim, 70 elders, because if you want to maintain some type of legal control over the laws of the Jewish faith, the only way to do it is not have a single leader in whose word we trust, but have a group, a leadership group, whom we can consult. One person being an oracle is not a model that has ever fitted in Judaism. We don't have one prophet who defines the religion. We have a group of people to whom we turn. And to this day we have this concept. We never go to one rabbi to decide a dispute. It has to be at least 3 or 5. Or we have this concept of Da'at Torah, that we go to rabbis and we seek their advice and we seek their help when we have a problem. Not because their opinion is the only opinion, but because we seek the opinions of rabbis who make up a whole and who guide the Jewish faith forward. The other thing he's credited with is very interesting. He's credited with reintroducing something called Ketav Ashurit. Ketav Ashurit, you're all familiar with. If you attended the Hachnasa Sefer Torah that we did a few weeks ago at the shul, you'll recall that the Sofer writes Hebrew in a very particular way, with square letters. However, if you read ancient texts in Hebrew, I say read, you wouldn't be able to read them. They're written in a very basic format. The letters are very basic, just a few lines and squiggles. That is not the way you write a Sefer Torah. The formal font of a Sefer Torah is the one that we use to this day, and according to the Talmud was the one that was reintroduced. It had been the original font, so to speak, of Hebrew, and was reintroduced by Ezra during that period. Then we have Nehemiah. Nehemiah probably lived at the same time as Ezra. Again, it's unclear. The books are always together. Ezra and Nehemiah, by the way, is considered one book. of the books of Tanakh. It's not considered two books. They are combined book because they seem to be describing the same period. But there's some dispute as to whether they actually lived alongside each other or at a slightly different time. He was from the tribe of Yehudah, and he was appointed the governor of Judea by the Persian king Artaxerxes. I hope I pronounced that right. He returned to Jerusalem and helped to rebuild it. And he was either before or after Ezra. And there's no evidence besides, obviously, for Tanakh, where they are mentioned together in the Psukim, but they're mentioned separately as well. It's hard to know whether they lived at the same time. Finally, we have the final prophet, Malachi. He was the final one of the 12 minor prophets. He slightly beat Haggai in terms of chapters. He's got 3 to Haggai's 2. There's some disagreement, well, a lot of disagreement as to when he lived, Malachi. And in fact, we don't even know if Malachi was his name. Was he called Malachi? Or is Malachi just a word that describes a messenger, Malach? We don't know his name. Malachi is the way he's described in Tanakh, and his prophecies are fairly obscure. They're not narratives. They're not what we are familiar with, if we read the Torah or the Haftarah every week, we're used to stories. It's not stories, it's prophecies, and they're quite dense and difficult. So what I'd like to do now is describe to you Yehud Medinata. In 539, as we know, Babylon fell to the Persians. And this event, by the way, we can date from external, non-biblical sources. According to the Bible, during the first year we learnt of Cyrus's reign. He issued this declaration, and he said that the people who had been originally deported from the land of Israel could now return there. A year later, led by Zerubabel, the 42,360 exiles, according to the text of Ezra, returned to Yehud, and Zerubabel and Yeshua the priest reinstituted sacrifices. That was a major move. Imagine they come to this broken temple, and they come there, nothing's built, they've got no way of building it. These are not engineers, these are not contractors, these are not builders. These are cultured people who've been living in the lap of luxury in Babylon, coming to this bare hillside, and they begin bringing sacrifices. They've not brought sacrifices for 70 years, or at least many decades, and suddenly they're bringing sacrifices again. According to the book of Ezra, Yeshua and Zerubabel were frustrated in their efforts to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Guess what? Machlokas. Jews always tend to argue with each other. In this case, the Jews who were left behind, they weren't called Jews, they were called Samaritans. We're familiar with Samaritans. Samaritans lived in the north of the land of Israel. They were descended possibly from the 10 tribes. Rabbinic Jews didn't think so. They called them Kutim. Kutim was a place which was outside of Israel, and they say that these people were marauders, they were imposters who'd come into the land of Israel and called themselves Jews. And we have, by the way, a whole range of these external groups who are considered marginal and imposters by the rabbis. Kutim, by Susim, Shomronim, Samaritans. We have this entire range of people who had said, kept strictly to the letter of the law, but didn't keep the rabbinic practices that had been established and had been carried out and kept in order so that the words of the law could make sense. We're going to find out later that there was another group, finally, a sect of Jews called Tzidukim. I remember the word Tzidukim comes from the word tzadok. So we're going to learn about that as well. So the Samaritans initially were very friendly with a group of Jews who returned from Babylon. I'm imagining that the reason that they liked them is because they came laden with a lot of cash. The Jews from Babel were rich. They came with a lot of money. Do you remember that Cyrus and later on Darius gave them all the vessels from the temple, and he let them bring them back. They took them back to Jerusalem. Oh wow, all these people, all these rich Jews are coming to Israel. Let's see if we can hit them up for a bit of cash. But the Samaritans were accused by the Jews who had returned of not being Jews. You aren't real Jews, we are real Jews. And the Samaritans weren't very happy with that. And what they did was, they went to Bavel and they complained about these upstart wealthy Jews who were trying to take over the land of Israel. And they frustrated the attempts by these Jews who were intent on building a temple. The book of Ezra dates Ezra's arrival in Jerusalem to the second year of a king called Artaxerxes. Its position in the narrative implies that this was Artaxerxes II, in which case the year was roughly 458 BCE. So if you remember, we've talked about 538, we're now 458, so about 80 years after the initial returnees came back. Ezra, who was a scholar of the commandments of the God of Israel, was commissioned by Artaxerxes, appropriately, to rebuild the temple and to enforce the law of Moses in this area that was known. It didn't have a name. It was called Yehud to us. It was a province, but it was called, believe it or not, the place beyond the river. Even the river didn't have a name. The place beyond the Jordan River was known as, in ancient Babylonia, as beyond the river. Build your temple there, you people. You go back to your land and build your temple. What Ezra found is that he'd come to a country where those Jews who'd remained behind, and now there seems to be a lot of scholarly debate on this subject, but it almost unanimously, the scholars seem to believe that there wasn't an enormous amount of deporting of Jews in the latter part of the First Temple period. Many Jews stayed behind, and they intermarried with the non-Jews, the pagans who lived there. Ezra comes back, and he finds even the Jews who'd returned were marrying non-Jews. And he was informed that the wall of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and him and Nehemiah, either him and Nehemiah or him or Nehemiah, rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. The Babylonians, it would seem, as I said, deported only a small number of Jews from Jerusalem, and of those exiled to Babylon, only a very small number returned to the land of Israel. And the population of Persian period Jerusalem, how many people do you think lived there? We always assume, oh my gosh, I mean, they all came back to the land of Israel, right? I mean, this was a group returning to rebuild their temple. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. Well, the range of numbers, of the estimate of the number of Jews who lived in Jerusalem in this early period of the Persian return is between 500 and 1,500 Jews. That's how many Jews lived in Jerusalem. Persian Yehud experienced a huge religious upheaval over the construction of the temple, and the discussion became centered around how God should be worshipped. Now, I want to tell you an interesting thing. I touched on it before, but I mentioned to you that there were a number of significant figures in the caste list, as I called it. There was a fellow or chap called Sheshbazzar, or Zerubabel. He was descended, remember, from whom? From King David. Then there was a chap called Yehoshua ben Yehud Tzadok. He was the Kohen Gadol. And then we had a bunch of prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. That's very significant, because that was the leadership structure of the First Temple period. You had a king, who was of Davidic descent. You had the prophets, who advised the king, and who were the mouthpiece of God in the biblical narrative. And you had the Kohanim. That was the leadership structure of the Jews in the First Temple period. What do Jews who are returning, what do? You're coming back. You want to recreate that which you've lost. The First Temple has been destroyed. You've got the opportunity to rebuild the temple, to create that which has been lost. What do? You try and create an exact replica of that which had preceded you. So that's what they did. They came back. They're looking for a king. They have King Zerubabel. They're looking for a Kohen Gadol. They have Yeshua, Kohen Gadol. They're looking for a Shmuel Hanavi, right? The same as David HaMelech had Shmuel. They're looking for a Shmuel. Who do they have? They have Haggai. They have Zechariah. They have Malachi. But guess what? The structure didn't work. You try to recreate something that existed previously and it doesn't catch. There was no traction. So what did they do? Leadership of the Jewish people morphed into something completely different. 80 years later, you have Nehemiah. Yes, he's still descended from the king, but he's no longer called the king. He's a governor, he's a leader. And then you have Ezra HaSofer. He's a Kohen, but he's not called Kohen Gadol. What's he called? Scribe. The scribes later on become rabbis. You have a new leadership structure which emerges, which is priests who become leaders. The priestly clan become leaders like the kings. The high priest of the Jews becomes the leader of the Jews, the king of the Jews, not called king, not until the time of the Hasmonean kingdom, but the priests become the kings, the leaders, and the rabbis become the conscience. They become like the prophets. And this threefold structure becomes a twofold structure, and the leadership of the Jewish people changes, and guess what? The Jewish religion changes. The whole of the Jewish religion now is a tension between religion on the one hand and priestly duties and the temple on the other hand. And that tension is going to continue until the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, until eventually, who emerges, I guess, victorious? The rabbinic class, which is of course why we have rabbinic Judaism. Because the Judaism that could sustain itself without the temple is not a kingly Judaism. There's no longer any kings, and there's no longer land to be a king over. It's not a priestly or a temple Judaism, because there's no longer a temple to do temple worship. But it is a scribe or a rabbi Judaism, where the rabbis determine the way the religion should progress and unfold. I want to, if I may, give you a small map. I can ask you, Daniela, just to get this out. It's in Hebrew, but I will be going over it in English. It's a map of the land, the province of Yehud Medinata. A number of very interesting things you're going to see on this map. The first is, of course, if those of you who are familiar with the size of the state of Israel, is how incredibly small this piece of land is. This piece of real estate is tiny. Had we got this in 1947 from the United Nations, we would not have been quite so happy. If you look, quite a shocking thing is the fact that on the west, we would have expected the land of Yehud Medinata to stretch to the coastline, that we have access to trade routes, we have access to the sea. The Jews did not have access to the sea. Yafa and Yavne were in a region which in this map it's called Ashdod. I don't know what it was called then, but these were not Jewish places. To the north, Shomron, Samaria, where the Samaritans live. Shomron, over here, Shomron is not Jewish, because the Samaritans were not considered by those who occupied and lived in Yehud Medinata to be Jews. And they certainly didn't consider themselves to be like the Jews of Yehud Medinata. And in fact, a very short time after the second temple was built, they built their own temple on Har Gerizim, near Shechem. There's still a cult of Samaritans who to this day, around the time of Pesach, bring a paschal lamb, a korban Pesach, on Har Gerizim. There's a few hundred of them left in Israel to this day. Another shocking thing that you'll find is in the south, a place called Edom. Idumea is the way it's called in English. Edom we always expect to be somewhere in the deep south of Israel. But actually, it wasn't in the deep, deep south of Israel. It wasn't somewhere near Eilat or Beersheba. It was right there in the north. People who came from Idumea were in very close proximity to the land of Judea, which is of course why, at a later stage, the family of King Herod, who was an Idumean, were absorbed into the Jewish nation, because they didn't live somewhere beyond the pale, they lived very, very close. So this is a land that's locked in between the Yam HaMelach and the Jordan River, doesn't even have access to the sea, enemies to the north called the Samaritans, unfriendly neighbors to the south in Edom, descendants possibly of Esau, and here they are returning to their country, to a tiny piece of real estate, a piece of land called Yehud, where Yerushalayim isn't even big enough to be considered a capital, where they have to travel north to Mitzpeh. And Mitzpeh is the capital of the province. That is the capital of Yehud. Even Hebron is not included in this tiny country. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the center of gravity had shifted northwards. So instead of Hebron being included, now it's places like Chatzor and Ramah, which were considered part of Judea. And this region, which was once a part of the kingdom of Israel, was far more densely populated than Judah. In other words, where the tribe of Judah had lived, and now held both the administrative capital, which was Mitzpah, and the major religious center of Bethel. Bethel was where the religious Jews had lived before this group of returnees had come to Jerusalem. So it's not quite the picture we expect. It's not quite what we believe. We want to believe romantically that these Jews came back to Jerusalem to the accompanying sound of Hollywood organ, right? And that somehow the temple was there shimmering in light, and they rebuilt it, and there was a fantastic Hollywood ending. It took a long, long time for any type of positive construction to take place, and for any type of result that we might have seen as a victory. From about 445 BCE onwards, Jerusalem finally became the capital. So about 100 years after they returned, that's when Jerusalem became the capital of Yehud. And only when there were city walls and an active temple, that's when it became a serious place. Because a capital city needs all the amenities and all the things you would expect from a town or a city where where the things that happen in a capital take place, where a court can sit, where there can be a governor who lives there in the style that one is accustomed to as a governor. Not just some remote place on a hillside, unprotected and uncultivated. So as I said, 1,500 people living in Jerusalem at a maximum. Where did people in Yehud live? What was it like to live in Yehud? And the answer to that question is pretty miserable. They lived in tiny shacks, in tiny villages. They were mainly poor farmers. There was very little trade because they had no access to trade routes. And it would take, as we're going to hear, the Greek Empire and later on the Roman Empire to open up Judea to the wider world. But in these early years, Judea was a backwater. Importantly, there's no evidence whatsoever, absolutely no evidence at all, in the archaeological finds of the area that records a massive influx of migration of Jews from Babylon. It would seem that the vast majority of Jews remained outside of Yehud Medinata, even though their temple was built. And the most important development for Judaism in this post-exilic period was the promotion, and I'm guessing it was some type of self-preservation, but listen to this. The promotion of the idea and the practice of Jewish exclusivity in terms of intermarriage. How interesting. Think about it. In the time of the Torah, and in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, there was no prohibition against intermarriage. Of course, whoever you married had to convert and become a part of whatever it was that meant to be Jewish at that time. But the kings married non-Jews, the queens married non-Jews, or people who weren't descended from Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Even our forefathers married people who were outside of that circle. Yosef HaTzadik married the daughter of an Egyptian. There was no criticism of them for doing so. In the Second Temple, it became a dominant feature of being a Jew that you couldn't marry outside of your own group, of your own defined nation. There would be no intermixing and intermingling of the Jewish nation with the nations that surrounded them. That was what defined Judaism, not just the religious practice. It would be hard to become a Jew, and no Jew was meant to stray beyond that pale. And this innovation is reflected in Ezra's horror at learning the Jews were intermarrying with non-Jews. And I have to say, it's the first time any such sentiment was ever expressed in the Tanakh. And it's right at the end of Tanakh. Of course, it becomes a dominant practice, and it's practiced to this day. I don't know what to leave out. That is my problem now, because I promised you so much, and I feel that I cannot do justice to the amount I still have to say. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to break here and continue with Ezra and the closing of the canon and the Elephantine Temple next week, because I feel that I owe you an explanation about the timeline of Jewish history. And when I say an explanation, I know I've got 15 minutes left. It's a full lecture in and of itself. It's such an important subject. I really feel that we need to go through it. So if I read it, but we'll go through it together. Let me explain to you the problem. The problem is, I grew up in a traditional Jewish educational system that taught me that which Chazal had stated. The first temple stood for 410 years. There it is, right at the top of your page. The second temple stood for 420 years, and in between there was an exile period of 70 years. So if we use these numbers, we're going to work backwards. We know for sure, because recorded history was by that time so recorded, that there's no dispute about the fact that the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, 70 of the Christian era. In which case, if you work backwards, and the Second Temple was built 420 years before, that means it was built in the year 350 before the Christian era. Which means, if you go back a further 70 years, that the Babylonian exile began around 420 BCE. Okay, you still following me? And that means, if you say now 410 years before was when the first Beit HaMikdash was built, it was built in 830 BCE. That is the traditional, the Gemara, which is in Avodah Zarah, comes from an original thing. I think it's Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, who is a very, very prominent Tana, who wrote a sefer called Seder Olam. Seder Olam is basically charts the timeline of history according to Jewish tradition. So these numbers are taken from Seder Olam, they're reproduced in the Talmud, and these are the numbers that we're all familiar with. 420, 70, 410, working backwards. However, and now come to the bottom of the page, I hope I've set it out in a way that makes sense, but I think I have. So the secular historians, when I say secular historians, I'm not talking about people who don't believe in God, irreligious, who are interested in discarding traditional views. These are not people who have some agenda against Seder Olam or the Talmud. These are people who have used the techniques of historical research and have come up, based on the various sources that exist, with the following dates as verified dates of when things happened in the course of history, in the course of time, okay? So when I say secular, I don't mean irreligious or anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or somehow anti-Talmudic. No. These are historians that use the methods that we all recognize and all believe in. The Second Temple, everyone agrees, was destroyed in 70 CE, okay? However, using these external research techniques, they say the Second Temple was built in 516 BCE. The Babylonian exile actually ended some 22 years before, in 538, when Cyrus the Great issued his proclamation. And the Babylonian exile was actually divided into several stages. The final deportation took place in 582. Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, which was when the temple was destroyed, was 587 or 586. And there are discrepancies of a year or two here and there. King Yehoiachin, who was the second last king, we mentioned him earlier, was deported in 597. Hananiah, Michael, Azariah and Doniel, who were the last, if you recall, the last prophets of the first temple, they were deported to Babylon in 606. And the first temple, and this is according to all the sources that historians are used to using, was built in 950 BCE. Now it's interesting, I'm just going to mention it here as a complete side point. According to this, the first temple was from 950 to 587, which is not 410 years. So that's interesting in and of itself. But that is not the important point. The important point, and I'll turn over the page, the Babylonian exile lasted, I put here 68 years, a year here or there, if that's not the important point. The 70 years makes sense. It could be 605, it could be 604, because they had different ways of calculating years. They calculated years according to the reigns of kings. They calculated years, sometimes some people began it in the winter, some people began it in the summer, so that's quite hard to calculate. It doesn't matter if there's a discrepancy of 1 or 2 years. Also depends if a particular counting system starts in the year 0 or the year 1. Okay? So that's not important. What is important, though, is that the Second Temple didn't last for 420 years. It lasted for 586 years. You know what? That is quite a big discrepancy. That is quite a significant difference. 420 and 586 is a difference of 166 years. So again, it could be 163, 164, 165, 166. It's a difference of a lot in terms of years between the Seder Olam version and the version that we have from our historical sources. And we use those historical sources for all kinds of things. We can't just dismiss historical sources or historical methods because they don't suit our theological origins and affiliations. Okay. Again, I put here a number of other, I put here a full timeline of important years for the Second Temple period. I've used the secular scholarship. I leave you with this sheet of paper. It's be useful for you. You can either take it with you. I'll have more of them next week. If you lose them, don't worry. This is very important in terms of the years because it describes many of the years that are relevant to the course which is going to be taking place over the next 3 weeks. But what I want to mention, I'm going to use a particular resource. I come from, I said it last week, from a Yeki background. My father was born in Königsberg in East Prussia. My grandfather, one was born in Hamburg, another one was born in Cologne. My grandmother was born in Breslau. My great-grandparents were born in Frankfurt. I come from good German stock. one of the leading rabbis of the German Jewish community in this country in the post-war period, he died in the 1990s, was a man called Rabbi Shimon Schwab. Rabbi Shimon Schwab was from Frankfurt. He was the rabbi of the Breuers community in Washington Heights. And he was a deep thinker and a man, because of his German origins, he wasn't affiliated with a Hasidic community, he wasn't affiliated with the Lithuanian community, although he'd studied at a Lithuanian yeshiva. His thinking was quite different from the austere or maybe less flexible methods of thinking that exist in those worlds. And he wrote an essay in 1962 in the Jubilee volume for Rabbi Breuer. I'm conscious of the time. It's a very interesting essay, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. Reason number one is it's not what you'd expect a traditional rabbi to say. But reason number two, and I knew Rabbi Schwab, it's interesting because he fully retracted it 30 years later.
Wow.
Okay, I'm going to read you excerpts from that essay. If anybody wants it, together with the retraction, if you can email me or Lisa tomorrow, I can arrange for it to be sent to you. There's a link, or I can arrange for a copy to be dropped to you. He goes through what I've just told you in a little bit of more detailed way, and he responds as follows. The Torah true historian is now confronted with a truly vexing problem. Ancient history of the Babylonian and Persian empires presents us with completely different data to the data which you've just heard in Seder Olam and the Talmud. These figures can hardly be doubted. You listen to what he's saying. He's saying about secular historians using the methods which we are all familiar with. They can't be doubted, for they appear to be the result of painstaking research by hundreds of scholars and are born out of profound erudition and by ever-increasing authoritative evidence. Sometimes small discrepancies of a year or two at the most have yet to be accounted for, but complete agreement seems to be almost within reach at the present time in terms of, and I'm just going to present it in the very blunt way I did right at the end of my earlier introduction, 586 years is a massive difference to 420 years, and it's almost impossible to dismiss, as he puts it, the scholars who came up with the figure of 586. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The gravity of this intellectual dilemma posed by such enormous discrepancies must not be underestimated. The gravity he's talking about is a theological gravity. We all subscribe to Chazal. We live our lives, our Jewish lives, according to the holy words of our holy sages who interpreted the Torah, the mitzvahs we keep, the Shabbos that we observe, the kosher that we eat, is all according to the words of Chazal. To simply dismiss them as uninformed is itself uninformed. Why? It's not as if Chazal lived 2,000 years after the events that they were describing and in which they missed 166 years. They lived a couple of hundred years, 200, 300, 400 years later. How does it make sense that they've made such a massive error? So there's huge gravity in terms of simply dismissing Chazal, dismissing Talmudic sages and saying, well, in that thing they didn't know what they were talking about. The unsuspecting students are faced with a puzzle that appears insoluble. How could it have been that our forebears had no knowledge of a period in history otherwise widely known and amply documented, which lasted over a span of 165 plus years, and which was less than 600 years removed in time from the days of the sages who recorded our traditional chronology in Seder Olam? Is it really possible to assume that some form of historical amnesia had been allowed to take possession of the collective memory of an entire people? This should be quite like assuming that some group of recognized historians of today would publish a textbook on medieval history, ignoring all the records of, say, the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era? Would this not seem inconceivable, even for those who unfortunately do not possess the necessary emunas chachomim to accept the word of our sages? Rabbi Schwab is very puzzled, and he offers two alternative explanations, and then a third. The first explanation he puts in the following words: faithfully, we must put our trust in the superior wisdom of our inspired teachers of Torah, who have arrived at the absolute truth, and consequently to reject categorically and absolutely the right of any secular scientist, even the most objective in his field, to contradict our convictions. In other words, one alternative to this puzzle is just to say, actually, despite all our critical faculties, despite the fact that we're intelligent human beings, the historians are wrong and the rabbis are right. That's one alternative. That's an alternative, I have to say. It's a fundamentalist view, and I'm sure there are people who believe that. On the other hand, he says, we might accept the unanimous opinion of secular historians as coming as close to the objective truth as possible, but make an ingenious attempt to interpret the biblical data and to treat the traditional rabbinic chronology as mere agadic homily, which may lend itself to symbolic or allegorical evaluation. So he says, well, you know what? Actually, the historians are right. They got it right. They know what the chronology is. It was 586 years. It's not 420. And the rabbis have got some allegorical reason. You know, they like giving drushes. They like saying interesting things. They just said something interesting. This dilemma is very unfortunate, he writes. For it would appear that the only course to take would be either to correct secular ancient history by 165 years, which we would then have to call fictitious, or else to declare our traditional calendar to be based not on historical calculations, but on agadic pronouncements. He's not happy with that. Now, I know I'm going over time, and I apologize, but it's too interesting for me to give up now. He quotes the Me'orei Naim. The Me'orei Naim, I have a copy here, was published in the 16th century. It's a beautiful copy, actually. Which, believe it or not, was bound by a cousin of Rabbi Graydon's father. He was a book collector. They sold this collection some years ago, and I bought this copy. I didn't buy it for the binding, but from the Gradenwitz family. It's a most fantastic book, because it was for the first time this 16th century rabbi dismissed Seder Olam. Believe it or not. He said, sorry guys, this is not possible. It's not possible that this discrepancy exists, and therefore it's a mistake. As you can imagine, you can look at this book after I've concluded. As you can imagine, his decision to criticize rabbis who preceded him went down like a lead balloon. People weren't happy with him, he was criticized, the book was banned, some people burnt it. I mean, book burning and fundamentalism has always been a popular sport. And the Me'orei Naim was no exception. He was very controversial. And there were various others who also came up with explanations that seemed to follow the same derech, the same way as the Me'orei Naim. Rabbi Schwab said that he has a third way, not one of those two alternatives I described earlier. He says there's one unexplored avenue of approach to the vexing problem. It might be possible that our sages, for some unknown reason, covered up a certain historical period and purposely eliminated and suppressed all records and other materials pertaining thereto. If so, he asks, what might have been their compelling reason for so unusual a procedure? Nothing short of a divine command could have prompted our Chazal, those saintly men of truth, to leave out completely from our annals a period of 165 years. Well, he looks for the divine command and he finds it. We do indeed find a divine command conveyed by an angel to Daniel to seal the words and close the book. at the end of a long prophecy which begins in chapter 11 of Daniel and ends in chapter 12. In writing his divinely inspired book, writes Rabbi Schwab, Daniel obeyed the heavenly command, and it is safe to assume that our sages, who obviously had a thorough knowledge of the entire history of the Second Commonwealth, correspondingly eliminated in all chronological lists and pertinent discussion the same period which Daniel had to close and seal up. This was 1962. It's a radical theory. It's a theory which basically posits the following. Chazal knew that the second Beit HaMikdash lasted for 586 years. But because of a prophecy, and probably to do with not wanting to predict when the Messiah would come, that one shouldn't predict the arrival year of Mashiach, Chazal decided to simply lop off 165 something years, take it away from the history books, and create this confusion. So if people try and use some methodology to calculate the arrival time of Mashiach, they wouldn't be able to do it because those years are gone, and therefore it's going to throw you off. All your calculations will be wrong. That was his theory then. It was, I guess, published in a Jubilee volume to Rabbi Breuer, so it wasn't widely read. No disrespect to Rabbi Breuer, but the readership of these books wasn't huge. It was used by students of Jewish history as an acceptable method of dealing with this dilemma, and it was left to rest. In 1991, Rabbi Schwab allowed a legacy book to be published called Selected Speeches, a collection of addresses and essays on Hashkafa, contemporary issues and Jewish history. So famous by then was his essay on chronology that on the front cover of the book it says, including comparative Jewish chronology. Everyone buys the book, and guess what? There's an epilogue. And in the epilogue, he writes that he is retracting and withdrawing from his theory. And he gives 8 reasons. I've added a 9th. Not that I'm agreeing with his retraction or disagreeing with it. I've added a 9th because I think the 9th makes sense as well, and you'll understand why. Reason number 1, he said, theories are fine, but they cannot replace facts. We have no idea whether that's what Chazal wanted to do, therefore we cannot put something into their mouths. Perhaps our theory is not their theory, and their facts may be the correct facts. We've got no right to disagree with facts that they present to us as facts. Number 2, what right do we have to second guess Chazal, who decided to hide this 165-year period? If they decide to hide it, why would we come and reveal it? So he just feels that he's not worthy of being the one to come out and say, well, Chazal hid it. Well, if they hid it, then we shouldn't say that it's there. 3, the hidden year theory necessitates a second temple construction period, and I'm not going to go into the details of it now, of about 150 years. That means it took 150 years to build the second temple in that early period. He says that doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure that that's the case, but that's what he
They're
posits.
still building the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona. Over 100 years.
It's over 100 years, yes.
And St. John's the Divine in New York City is still under construction, over 100 years.
So,
And that's with modern technology.
that's with modern technology. I can't argue with Rabbi Schwab, he's no longer with us, but you understand that he's trying to make, again, this becomes a theological point. This is no longer a practical, historical point, it's a theological point. He says Josephus, this is an interesting point. Josephus, we mentioned him last week, Josephus Flavius, who describes the history of the period, does not mention a large gap of time between Ezra and the Greek period. In other words, after Ezra is finished, it shifts immediately into the Greek period. He said if there was a large gap, surely that should have been filled with some history. We don't know much about that period either. It's not mentioned in Tanakh. It's not mentioned in any place. So he says the fact that Josephus doesn't mention it seems to indicate, or at least he wants to use that as some kind of proof that there was no period of time between Ezra and the Greek period. Number 5, ancient documents, he says, which we use as historical records, historical sources, are very confusing and misleading. So, sometimes we add words and we add connotations and context which maybe we're adding because we want them to be there, not necessarily because they're there. The 6th reason he gives is it could be that an ancient nation would invent a history, this is a very dangerous path to go down, but would invent a history of kings and multiple historical figures because they wanted to create credibility for themselves as an ancient nation. In other words, of having a history when really they didn't have that history. So he said that this wasn't his suggestion, this was somebody wrote it to him in a letter, that it's possible that some ancient nation, he didn't mention which one, either he meant the Christians or he meant the Persians, would create some type of history that didn't exist, and maybe that's the 165-year period. You can account for it that way. The 7th reason he gives is that our moon calculations in terms of the moled. Remember the Gabbai always says the moled will be and gives a certain time. That moled has been calculated, believe it or not, going back all the way through to the beginning of calculated time. He says if you add a 165-year period, the moled is wrong and Rosh Chodesh should be like a day and a half later. Don't ask me how that works. He says it's complicated, but I've looked up other people, and even he writes there that we can get round that somehow. But other people have suggested that perhaps if we begin that calculation period from the time of Daniel or from the time of Ezra, rather than from the time of Adam HaRishon, that would account for it. So even he himself, the moon reason, he dismisses, and other people go into much more detail. The 8th reason he gives is that if we are 160 years, 8 years, 6 years, whatever it is, out in our count from Adam's birth, then you know what? Add 168 to 5774. Where are we now? Who's good at math here? 168 to 5774. There's 5884.
5942.
5942. Which means that we would be 68 years, 58 years away from 6,000. He says, you don't want to be 58 years away from the year 6,000 because the Gemara predicts some pretty radical and devastating things happening at the end of the 6th millennium. So he says, you don't want to add 168 years to your history. It's not something you'd want to do because you may live to see something you don't want to see. This isn't from Rabbi Sheshbazzar, but it's an interesting reason nonetheless. Chazal, very, very particular about dating documents. In fact, it's almost certain that the calculation of years that we have, this 5774 that we have, which dates from Adam HaRishon according to the count in the Bible, was calculated around the time of Ezra. If that's the case, and that's the date we use, what validates a document, any legal document, is the date. Imagine every single legal document for the last 5,774 years, or at least since the time of Ezra, is invalidated because the date on the document is wrong. Every get, every bill of sale, every bill of purchase is wrong because of the date that you've put on it that's not actually correct. That's a very big responsibility. Really what Rabbi Schwab was saying with all this retraction was, I'm not satisfied that there is no answer, but I'm very concerned that if I give an answer, that there's all type of repercussions that I'm not comfortable to live with. In fact, he writes this, our traditional, universally accepted Jewish way of counting the years since creation is sacred territory, which only fools do not fear to tread upon. I would rather leave a good question open than risk giving a wrong answer. With that, I end today. Thank you.
Thank you.